If you think about it, in the whole history of philosophy, there hasn't been really a man who has been more misunderstood than Epicurus himself. He has been given a reputation of being a philosopher who lived surrounded by women, surrounded by alcohol, surrounded by material pleasures, and that his teachings and his whole philosophy, his idea of Epicureanism, was a way of living surrounded of lust, of gluttony, and this is a misconception that comes from the Middle Age. It's a misconception that does no justice to the figure of Epicurus as a Greek philosopher, as a master of rhetoric, a man who mastered life, a man who managed to outlive most of the people of his generation. He lived about 72 years, which was a lot by the time, and he lived a calm and actually slow life, which is very different from that idea that you have of Epicurus being a man who lived full of pleasure, full of excess, because this whole idea of Epicureanism is actually much more different than the idea we currently have. And my whole idea with this video is to show you the true philosophy of Epicureanism, not this idea of a philosophy of material pleasure and nothing more than that, living full of pleasure and living full of lust and excess, but rather show you how profound and how useful Epicureanism actually is to live a calm, to live a peaceful, and most importantly, to live a fearless life. He had a very interesting way of living that I think is a great alternative for the times that we are living in today. But first, we need to understand why he has been so transduced and so misunderstood throughout history. Why did Epicurean philosophy change so much over time? How did we come to this point where we find Epicureanism as that wrong or that bad philosophy of sinful people? Well, to understand that, we first need to take a look at the times where Epicurus lived and which was the context of Epicureanism. How did Epicureanism flourish and how did Epicurus begin his teachings? Epicurus was born in the Greek island of Samos. He had Athenian parents and he died in Athens with about 72 years, which was much more than the average life expectancy at the time. He lived in the times of the Roman Republic, so most of his philosophy flourished and it became very popular in the times of the Roman Republic, before the Empire and before Christianity. He had a traditional Greek education, which was granted by his parents, and he had become specialized on rhetoric, which was the art of persuasion and public speaking. So he was very good at debating and he was actually very good at teaching his knowledge. He was, since a very young age, influenced by Democritus, because Democritus was mainly an atomist and he was a materialist. Atomism is basically the belief that the whole of reality, the universe and everything that is palpable is made of small particles that we cannot perceive, which are called atoms. And what Epicurus believed is that the changing of the atoms, their position, the swerve of the atoms, allowed human beings to have free will, because they were determined by these small particles, these small things that make the universe. They were not determined by some god or some higher being. So he was an anti-determinist because of this inheritance of atomism, and he was also a materialist, meaning that he believed in the real things, in the things that we can perceive with our senses. However, despite the influence that he had from Democritus, Epicurus himself insisted that he had been a self-taught philosopher. He learned from his predecessors, but he wanted to make a philosophy of his own. Thus, Epicurus built his own school, which was called the Garden, and he developed his own way of thinking, his own philosophy, that we call today Epicureanism. With all of this, we can see that he was quite controversial at the time, because he did not only deny the religious determinism of the Roman Republic and the Roman gods, but he allowed women and he allowed slaves into his own school. He was against that sort of discrimination. So he was a very modern philosopher, or he was ahead of his time, and he was a man who actually lived in a pretty liberal way for today's standards. So what happened with all the teachings of Epicurus? What happened with the actual knowledge of Epicureanism? Why we have this transduced vision of him today? It is said that throughout his whole life, Epicurus wrote more than 30 writings, but most of them got lost with the passing of time. The truth is that with the rising of Christianity after the death of Epicurus, the aggression of Christianity against a man who taught against religion, against faith, meant that most of Epicurus' writings disappeared in the times of Christianity and the Middle Ages. And that's where we got to the point where most of his ideas were changed into this bad reputation of him being a philosopher of just simple pleasure, human pleasure, lust, gluttony. However, some of the writings of Epicurus survived. Nowadays we only have 3 writings and some fragments that we have from Epicurus himself directly, which are the letters to Menocius, the letters to Pythocles, and the letters to Herodotus. However, most of his thoughts were learned through posterior writings of people who inherited Epicureanism in the future of the Roman Empire. For example, the biographer and writer Diogenes Laertius wrote about him in the times of the Roman Empire, after Epicurus was dead. And Lucretius, a Roman poet, made his ideas popular among the empire throughout the years, teaching Epicureanism after Epicurus. Some other examples of figures that inherited and practiced Epicureanism are Cicero, the Roman statesman, and Philodemus, another philosopher that's very well known for being a heir of Epicureanism. So, the main reason why Epicureanism has been changed and has become a controversial philosophy is because early Christianity was very hostile against Epicureanism. Epicurus has been inaccurately promoted as a patron of drunkards and gluttons, and they related him, wrongfully, with a philosophy of excess, of lust. But Epicurus himself said, wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants, which meant that Epicurus didn't believe in useless wealth and just living life like there is no tomorrow and just drinking and surrounded by women and surrounded by parties. He didn't live in that way. It was very, very different from that vision. And what I'm going to show you now is the main ideas of this philosophy of Epicureanism. I will teach you the main points of the true Epicureanism so you can understand the true philosophy and what Epicurus really meant, so we can apply it into our own lives. Based on the writings that we have today, Epicurus was a materialist. So he didn't believe in faith or religion, but rather on the things that we could perceive with our senses, that we could actually touch, see, and listen, and smell, and taste. He was part of this Hellenistic period of philosophy, so Epicureanism coexisted with Stoicism, he coexisted with skepticism, and he was also a hedonist. And there is a bad image of hedonism, because Epicurus, being a hedonist, he believed that the purpose of philosophy is to be happy and to help others to be happy. So Epicurus wanted to achieve this idea of the eudaimonia, which was a good spirit or a state of moral wellness. He wanted to achieve this sort of complete moral happiness, and that was this idea of pleasure that we tried to show. Because pleasure for Epicurus wasn't just drinking and partying. Pleasure was this eudaimonia, this good spirit, this state of moral wellness. And to achieve that state of moral happiness, he developed a calm and a slow life, which is very different from the idea we've got today. So this might explain how he managed to outlive many of his generation. He developed a calm and slow way of living, full of pleasure, but of moral pleasure, not of simple material pleasure. That's why he found his purpose and the purpose of philosophy in finding happiness through pleasure, because pleasure was this good spirit, this eudaimonia. And contrary to the common belief, Epicurus didn't live a life full of lust, gluttony, and material pleasure. He wasn't surrounded by women nor alcohol. He developed a life of real pleasures, of the pleasures of life, of being alive. He always promoted being self-sufficient, to be surrounded by healthy relationships and healthy friendships. And he put the focus on being well surrounded, because to him the main idea of life was not only being happy and finding this state of pleasure, but to also promote and help others. to achieve pleasure and to achieve moral wellness. So Epicurus put a lot of focus on having healthy relationships and also being self-sufficient. The whole life of Epicurus revolved around following two main concepts or two main ideas. One of them being the ataraxia, which is translated as literally imperturbability or equanimity, and that was his way of living life in freedom, because ataraxia meant a lasting state of peace made possible by the absence of fear. So ataraxia was the absence of fear. He was at peace and he was calm, and his soul was calm because he was lacking fear. How did he manage to lack fear? He believed that what made people unhappy at his time and what makes a lot of people unhappy nowadays is either the denial of death with religion, as he thought that religion put doubt into the minds of the people and that faith made him doubt about death, or this idea that death was a painful and horrible moment, which he denied because he thought that death can be peaceful if you had lived in a pleasant way. So this whole idea of ataraxia, of being at peace, being at equanimity, was because of this absence of fear to death. Epicurus himself said, "Why should I fear death? If I am, then death is not. And if death is, then I am not. Why should I fear that which can only exist when I do not?" Then the second main concept that Epicurus followed throughout his life, and that I think that we all should follow throughout our lives, is this idea of the Aponia, which is literally translated as absence of pain. So ataraxia was the absence of fear, and Aponia was the absence of pain. This is the main point, the main controversial point, because when Epicurus is said to be a philosopher of pleasure, it actually means this: he wanted to reduce or to avoid the amount of pain that he had in life, and many people mistake this idea of him evading his problems or either evading most of the hard work or the issues that there are in life and that are inevitable, in order to avoid pain or avoid tiredness. And that's not the main idea. When Epicurus teaches this idea of aponia, to reduce the amount of pain, what he actually is saying is that you have to live in a way where your own mind is calm and doesn't hurt you. You don't have to hurt yourself. You have to do the things you've got to do without thinking on the possible outcomes that may disturb you, or without thinking on the wrong things that may cause you pain. Don't feel bad if you can choose to feel good. In that sense, we can see a sort of similarity between Epicureanism and Stoicism. I want to make a brief comparison here because Stoicism being the more popular and more known philosophy nowadays, Epicureanism can be an alternative to Stoicism. So they had a big point in common, that apart from the fact that they were both Hellenistic philosophies, they were also naturalist philosophies. So Epicureanism and Stoicism put the focus on the real nature of things and to live accordingly to our nature, to our human nature. Another point in common might be this idea that Epicureanism didn't believe that the purpose of life was just pleasure. He believed that to live pleasurably, your life had to be noble, and it had to be according to a sense of justice, not just simple and mundane enjoyment. He promoted a pleasure, but a pleasure with meaning, which can be very similar to this idea of living with virtue in Stoicism. There is a phrase from Epicurus which states that he who least needs tomorrow will most gladly greet tomorrow. That idea is very similar to the concept of memento mori, developed by Seneca, which is thought to be the founder of Stoicism. However, Epicureanism adds this idea of not just making the most out of today in terms of being productive and doing all we can because we may not have it tomorrow, but to also enjoy our life today and enjoy the material pleasures that we have today, but with a meaning, not only because there is no tomorrow, but to enjoy them with a moral state of wellness. And to me, the biggest point of difference seems to be that Stoicism believes in, most of the time, an idea of asceticism or renouncing most of the material pleasures. Stoicism believes that actual happiness is only possible through living in a state of humbleness and satisfying our natural needs, not going over that path, not going over our needs. Live with virtue and be good because we are made to do so. Epicureanism, however, believes that pleasure and happiness in life comes from enjoying material things. We have to enjoy all those things we have the lack to have food and to have good food, and we have drinks and we have friends. Let's enjoy that. Alright, we don't have to deny all of that. Epicureanism doesn't restrain itself to limitations, but it teaches how to enjoy a peaceful and fearless life in order to die in peace. He gives this certainty and he's sort of a middle point in which he teaches to enjoy life, but also have some purpose in it. Be balanced. What I actually think is most useful to all of us is how can Epicureanism help us nowadays? What can we get from Epicureanism to manage and swim around modern days? I believe that with the rising popularity of Stoicism, people are misunderstanding it and living their lives, restraining their feelings, developing a cold approach to life, and losing contact with what's real, the real pleasures that make a reality. So I believe that Epicurus' teachings can be a great alternative, and to follow Epicureanism and allowing ourselves to feel and experience all that this world has to offer in the real world, so we can achieve this state of aponia, of absence of pain, we can live life in ease, and we can also be more calm when facing death. I believe that in this new digital society, where we are the most connected, where everything happens fast and instantly, it just created more lonely and more stressed people that are the most disconnected than ever with the real world and with the true nature of things. So Epicureanism can help us to come back and to enjoy the true pleasures, true dopamine, the true things that make life enjoyable. Epicureanism isn't about living in neon parties, in alcohol drinks, and in full lust and women. Rather, Epicureanism teaches to find pleasure in the slow, in the calm, and in the peaceful life, which can be achieved through material goods, but also through a deep sense of justice and through a deep sense of morals. Epicurus teaches us that in order to achieve ataraxia, absence of fear, equanimity, and live to die peacefully, it is very important to understand and reflect on oneself. If we know ourselves, we can differentiate between what will give us pleasure and what will give us pain. But most people nowadays are so disconnected of themselves and of the real nature of the world that they can't even do that, and they don't know themselves. So the first step that Epicureanism teaches is to know yourself, then to enjoy yourself, and then to share that enjoyment and that pleasure with others. Epicurus himself said, "He who has peace of mind disturbs neither himself nor another." So now you can see how Epicurus is one of the most misunderstood in the history of philosophy. I personally believe that Epicureanism can be really helpful. This philosophy of pleasure can be a moderate philosophy, interestingly enough, between these two extremes of either living without caring about anything and living wrongfully, and also becoming overly productive and just wanting to seize the day and do all the things you must do without actually sitting and enjoying life and all the material things that we have to enjoy here that we won't have them after death. So Epicureanism teaches us to enjoy our limited time here, to not worry about death or these unexpected things from life. They may come, but we have to face them in a way that we have peace of mind and in a state of moral wellness. It doesn't really matter what we do. The world won't change, the world will be the same, so let's live accordingly to all those things that we can sense and we can feel Let's just simply enjoy ourselves. What matters is to be good with oneself, to be morally good, to need all you want and to want all you need. Hope that you can take something useful about Epicureanism as I did. I hope that this video was helpful to you. I believe that if you want to see something more about philosophy, we will have many more videos coming. So stick around, let's enjoy our lives as Epicurus teaches us to do, and have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. See you in a future video.